Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Mr. Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content. And before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes, we are rolling through with another off-season review video once again. This time we're going to cover two teams, the Milwaukee Bucks in the East and the Houston Rockets in the Western Conference. We'll start with the Milwaukee Bucks, and what a year or so it has been, right? Because I remember the first year that we covered this, that we started this podcast. This was back when the Bucks were, a one seed. I think that year, that was the year they won 60 whatever games and lost to the Heat in the first round. They make the big trade for Damian Lillard. We liked the trade. We understood it. We still didn't pick them to win the East because we felt like the supporting cast around those guys, especially on the defensive end, wasn't quite good enough. First year, they sucked on defense, but their offense was really good. Then last year, they were good on defense for the most part early in the season, but their offense kind of stunk, right? And they made some different moves. They brought some guys in. And then obviously in the playoffs, Dame misses the first few games with the blood clots. Then he comes back and tears his Achilles, and they lose in 5 to the Pacers. Then, of course, comes the event in the offseason that kicks off the Bucks offseason, right? After the Giannis trade talks, which seemed like they had died down, was them waiving and stretching Dame over 5 years, right? So he's now going to be paid tens of millions of dollars in dead money, right? Basically, if you do the math, about 120 million or so in dead money over the next 5 years, when before that, right, it was that same amount over like 2 years, right? So but they did that in order to bring in Myles Turner, right, who they took from the Indiana Pacers, and which was another shocking move, right? Because I think the Turner move came first. And then everybody was talking about, well, how are they going to be able to sign Turner? They need to clear money. Yeah, that's how they did it. So you lost Brook Lopez. He left and went to the Clippers, and you bring in Turner. I mean, with Turner, he's the younger guy, right? He's a better athlete. He can still shoot and space the floor and block shots. Again, he played very well for the Pacers last year. In the playoffs, he was up and down. He played well in the earlier rounds, but it felt like as the playoffs went on, you didn't get quite as much out of him consistently. In the finals, I remember, he played well on the defensive end, but offensively couldn't really hit a shot. They didn't really guard him a whole lot, and there were some real issues there, in with his play. But, in Milwaukee, I mean, he'll probably have a similar role. The only issue is you're not playing with, a pass first guard type player in Tyrese Halliburton, right? Now, Giannis is a very good passer. He'll probably have more on ball opportunities in Milwaukee, right? Without Dame, he'll have to. He'll need to, but it's still not quite the same. So I do wonder offensively, how much different is he going to look playing with this team where you don't really have a lot of strong perimeter guard threats, because they brought in a lot of guards. I mean, they re-signed several guys who were already on the team, right? They re-signed Kevin Porter Jr. to a 2-year deal. They brought back Gary Trent Jr. on a 2-year deal. They brought back Taurean Prince. They brought back Ryan Rollins on a 3-year deal, right? All those guys on pretty good, affordable deals, right? Like none of those guys are being paid more than $5 million a year. Jericho Sims they brought back as well, though he's not a guard. And then they brought in a couple new guys, right? They brought in Gary Harris from Orlando as a guard, and then Cole Anthony, right, who was in Orlando. Then he was traded to Memphis, and then they cut him or bought him out so that way they could negotiate and re-sign Jaren Jackson Jr. and give him the money he was looking for. But, it's funny because you look at all these names and you see that there's a decent amount of depth, and they also brought back Portis as well, signed him to a 3-year deal. It's just the issue is that it's not quality depth, in my opinion. Like when you look at their starting backcourt, well, what the heck is the starting backcourt? I think you're going to assume Gary Trent Jr. probably will be the starting 2 guard. He started the year starting at the 2, and then eventually he didn't play as well, so he was moved to the second unit. Then in the playoffs, eventually he was brought back into the starting 5 because you just didn't have enough offensive juice, because he played much better as the year went on. But yeah, like what is the starting backcourt? Whatever it is, whichever combination it is, it's probably one of the worst in the league, right? And that's not really what you want if you're trying to, contend, let alone win the championship, right? I don't think, like, we know and understand that, say, the small guard archetype seems like it's starting to go away. But like you still have to have quality guard play. Like, you can't really get away with not having any good guards, above average guards on the team. And that's kind of the issue mainly that I have with the roster. Because, again, Turner's fine, and a lot of these individual players in a vacuum are fine. But just together, I don't really like the mix of it. Kuzma, right? He had a rough season last year, right? He didn't play well in Washington, got traded to Milwaukee. I guess was better, but just didn't really. I don't think he played quite as well as what you were hoping for. Had some decent games, but still shot the ball relatively poorly. Just I don't know if it's that he's just not a good fit, or if it's just he's just not the same player that he was a few years ago. Could be a mix of both. I mean, he's not even really old. He's only 30, but that's gonna be one of the guys that you're gonna be pretty dependent on because he's obviously gonna start and play a decent role for them. So I mean, in terms of the starting five, Turner, Giannis, and Kuzma are locked in. Then it's just a matter of who are the guards, and I have no clue, right? Like, I mean, I would assume maybe like Kevin Porter Jr., Gary Trent Jr., maybe that's your backcourt, but like you could find some combinations over the course of a game. I just think like in a 16 game playoff run, that's where I'm just not very high on it. Even in an 82 game stretch, I mean, you could kind of get away with a lot of different things, but I'm just not really sold on it. I understand that they did a lot of this to continue to try to appease Giannis to convince him to stay. And it seemed like the trade talks quieted down. But then, what was it, last week or earlier this week, right? There were reports of, well, Giannis might not be done. He might ask out, because Shams put that out there. Who knows what's going to happen, right? The Knicks re-signed Bridges, so maybe that's less likely to happen unless they put Towns in there or something. Who knows? But I don't know. Like I said, they could still win a number of games because you have Giannis, but we know in order to win the championship, you need more than just your superstar. You have to have quality depth behind them, and that's where I just, again, considering what could have happened, right, where like you just run it back, Dame's on the roster and he just doesn't play. I guess that would have probably been worse because you would have just had a $60 million player not playing at all. But I still don't really love the roster anyway. So it's like if you got off a Dame, I guess, but you're gonna have to be paying more money, or not more money, but you're gonna have to pay for that money over a longer period of time. Turner, we'll see. I'm sure he'll probably be good. How much better will he be? Probably not better than he was last year, if I had to guess. Probably be a little bit worse. And then after that, I'm not really sure. So it's kind of hard for me to give him anything much more than like a D, C at best, just because like you like some of the players that they brought in, and you didn't really lose anybody of significance outside of Lopez, and he's just an older player at this point, so you don't feel too bad about letting him walk. But I just don't really think that they did enough to make me feel that much different about them. Like they'll still probably be okay, but I don't think they'll be good enough to be able to win the East. But who knows? The East, because of the Pacers and the Celtics, with their injuries, maybe they might do a little bit better than what people think. But best case scenario, I don't see them getting much beyond the first round, maybe second round at best. But I just think some of those other teams are just better. Like the Knicks, like Giannis is a better player than anybody on the Knicks, but the Knicks team is better. The Cavs, they flamed out against the Pacers, but even then, I would still probably take them over Milwaukee. And then, I mean, after that, the other teams have to prove it, right? Like Orlando and Atlanta have to prove it. But I think their rosters are a little bit better than the Bucks, even though, again, Giannis is the best player of all, on compared to all the other best players on the other teams. But like I said, you need more than that. So I don't think, like I said, is this the worst possible thing that they could have done? Probably not, but I still don't think it's good enough. And I'm just not like a huge fan of most of what they did. But at least you retain a lot of those guys and you got them for relatively small amounts of money. So worst case scenario, but if this blows up and then they have to pivot, okay, I guess you could trade some of those guys, but you're not going to get anything back for them. And then if Giannis goes, the team is done anyways. I mean, you're not going to be able to do anything. So great job, guys, but I'm probably still going to have to give him a D for this one. And this might be controversial.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. In terms of the grade, I'm tempted really to actually bump it down to an F just because I think,
wow.
No, I'm serious, because I think we have to look at it from the perspective of all the hype that was built up a few seasons ago, right? When Dame first came to Milwaukee, there were Shaq and Kobe levels of dominance that were kind of just being thrown out there, right? In terms of, in theory, this is going to work. They're going to be the greatest pick and roll duo since Shaq and Kobe. And what did we get? Barely any pick and roll, no success in the postseason whatsoever. And that was the whole point of bringing a guy like Dame, from Portland to Milwaukee, right? This was, supposed to be the next all-time great pairing, and we didn't really get anything great out of it. So that's the main thing that's bogging the grade down. On top of the fact that you waived and stretched the contract. I get it. You did that so you'd be able to afford Myles Turner. But at the end of the day, right, it still is a bad look because look at the roster. It's so bare bones to the point where it doesn't even really make sense. If you kind of just cover up Giannis, I've seen the meme. Everybody's seen the meme. If you cover up Giannis on that team, you have absolutely nothing. That team does not even make the postseason whatsoever, right? And granted, they have some good role players, sure. But collectively, it's literally like you said. You couldn't have said it better, right? There's a difference between depth and quality depth. There's not a lot of quality here, especially when it comes to the postseason, because obviously that's the goal. Giannis can only get you but so far. We've seen that, throughout his entire career, especially post-championship and even pre-championship, right? There's a winning formula that you can have with the Milwaukee Bucks and especially around a guy like Giannis, but they continue to run and stray further and further away from that. And for the life of me, I'll never understand it, right? Myles Turner is a great upgrade from at the center position, but was it really worth getting rid of Dame and stretching that contract? No, I don't think so. I think, it makes you not as flexible as you probably think. Like you said, it was more of a move to appease Giannis, but now that's kind of been thrown up in the air. Like that might not even be the truth anymore, right? Giannis could still pretty much leave, whenever he wants or, attempt to, right? So I really don't know how anyone can really give a higher grade than a D, like you said, right? You lost Brook Lopez, you lost Dame, you lost Connaughton. Granted, I think the Lopez one doesn't hurt as much because you brought in Myles Turner, but in terms of the other additions like Micic, Gary Harris, Cole Anthony, that doesn't really scream, a championship roster. And unfortunately, I don't know. I think the Bucks might be one of the only teams in the league where you have like a true proven contender that has the absolute most incompetent roster built around him. And it's crazy, right? Because you have Giannis, who's a bona fide champion. We already know that he can win rings. He's done it before. But the roster is what's holding him back. And that's the unfortunate part because I feel like if he's on a different team, we're probably talking about that team potentially as the favorites. But instead, we're talking about Giannis wasting his years on a Milwaukee team and an organization that's completely incompetent and doesn't know how to build around him. I'm sorry. I have to light this one up because, like I said, we have to hold them to that standard of all the hype that they brought in by trading for Dame. And look where we are now.
Yeah, that's the tough part is that, you look at the roster and one guy and kind of a bunch of other dudes, that's not enough to be able to, win it all. And it's funny, right? Because looking back, right, I feel like people will say the Dame trade was a mistake. And it's like, well, it's understandable why they did it. I don't think we looked at it at the time and we're like, this is crazy.
No.
Why in the world would you do this? Because we understood, at a certain point, you looked at their previous big three and it was like, yeah, it probably has started to run its course because of the age of Holiday and Middleton. Middleton was still there, right? But just at a certain point, you could just kind of tell, yeah, they may just not have enough juice on the offensive end to keep this going. Right? That was able to work a few years ago when the East was different. It wasn't enough at the time. And then they bring in Dame. But like we said, they just didn't really have enough around those guys. And some of it's difficult, right? When you have, a couple of super max players, sometimes it's kind of hard to get the right pieces around them because, you need to kind of either get some diamonds in the rough, right? Get some guys that where it's like, oh, wow, this is a good player that's not making a whole lot of money, either through the draft or, undrafted free agency or whatever. Or you just have to get lucky in terms of some trades, where you kind of just take flyers on guys, buy low and see what happens. And then, they pan out. I think when Brook Lopez first came to Milwaukee, right, he was on a minimum, I think, because he was on the Lakers and he left. and then he just went to the Bucks because I guess he just hated that situation so bad. He went to the Bucks for the minimum. And then he was their starting center for a while, right? But now that had run its course. Middleton, right, was the second, one of the best players on a championship team, right? Like him and Holiday were like neck and neck for second best guy. Middleton was the second scorer, right? So he had, like he was one of the few guys that's had a 40-point game in the finals. But now, years later, older, more injury prone, and it was time to split it up. But just, now to go from Middleton, Holiday, or Middleton, Dame, Lopez to
Yeah.
go from this, right, where it's like, okay, who's the second best player on this roster? Myles Turner,
Right.
Kyle Kuzma, Bobby Portis. Like, I just
Oh,
don't really think, yeah, like that's a very significant drop off, and it's way more stark than any of the other teams that are kind of posed as contenders. So I just don't think they have a real shot at being able to do anything. And it's
I
just
agree.
kind of a matter of time of waiting of whether or not Giannis asks out, which it seemed like it was just kind of quiet and then it comes up again. And who knows? He still may not get traded this season. Like I could easily see a scenario where he just signs an extension and then maybe gets traded later, right? Like so that way he can get his money and then get out of there at some point. But I don't know, it's tough because the Bucks, the moves that they made in the past like weren't terrible moves, but it's just they didn't work. And then to try to get out of them, then they almost kind of compounded it. So like now you're definitely in a spot where it's like regardless of whether or not you have Giannis, you don't really have a shot. And then obviously once he's gone, you're completely done. Like it's over. Because I don't even think they really have their picks from here on out. So like you can't even really do those type of trades where it's like, well, let's get off of this contract by, trading a first or something like that. You can't even really do that. So, and I just that's the tough part. But, at least for Giannis, right? He had a great year last year. He added the mid-range shot. So he's still adding on to his skill sets, and that will definitely help him
Mhm.
as he ages because he is 31. But he's going to have to probably do a lot of heavy lifting this year just because, there's not a whole lot of high-level talent on this roster. And if he has to miss any significant length of time, I mean, you could say that about a lot of teams, but like they just don't have the ability to, I think, to withstand him missing any time. Like, and again, we know that outside of the top seeds, all these teams are separated by like a couple games. So if you have like one bad stretch where you're like 3-7 over 10 games, or like a 4-6, that could be the difference between being a 3 seed and like a 6-7 seed. Like we saw it last year and the year before that. Just crazy things can happen in this league. So I don't know what to really make of all of it. I guess the main question is what do you think happens with Giannis? Like, is your expectation that yeah, maybe he stays this year and then moves on after the year is up, or do you think that there is kind of that he may just stick around? Like, what do you think?
I think he's
What do you
got
think is a trade deadline thing?
I think he's got a plan. I think he rides this year, stays, right?
Mhm.
The following year, that's like you said, probably where something's gonna have to give, right? Because they're probably not gonna be able to do too much in that off season. And yeah, he's probably just gonna be fed up, especially if they have a horrible year like they're pretty much projected to this year. So
Mhm.
yeah, I would expect him to leave 2 seasons from now.
Yeah. And I guess, you look at their young players, that's the other part too, is they don't really have a lot of young guys where you kind of look at them as, pretty good prospects that have, a decent amount of potential, right? Like if you like I guess the youngest players on their roster, I mean Ryan Rollins had a good year for Milwaukee, he turned that into contract former Wizard if I'm not mistaken. So,
Yeah.
you
Funny story with
look
that, actually. He got freaking waived from the Wizards, I actually think, for shoplifting, if I'm not mistaken. Carry on.
yeah, yeah, I'm pretty sure that's correct. But I don't know if that's well, I don't think that was the reported reason, but it's like you probably just connect the dots.
Yeah.
Um, but after that, then it's like Tyler Smith, Andre Jackson Jr., and we just haven't seen a ton of those. Like Andre Jackson Jr. had some stretches where he was starting, and then after a while he just got nuked from the rotation. So I don't really know what to say about that. I think it's mainly just offensively. He just doesn't really do a whole lot. I
No,
mean, he's kind
can't
of a
shoot.
mediocre out. Yeah, he's a mediocre outside shooter. He plays hard and hustles, so he can be a good athlete, which can be helpful. And that's some of the kind of the type of player that this team needs. Like they
He's good
need
on
more.
defense, too.
Yeah, he's good on defense. He's a very good athlete, but I just think offensively, he just wasn't able to do a whole lot, and that was one of their issues over the course of the season last year. Was their offense was so limited outside of Dame and Giannis, right? So that was one of their issues. And Tyler Smith, I don't think we've really seen much of at all. I mean, he's still like a young guy, 21, but I don't really know what he is as of right now. I mean,
Fair.
have we seen? I mean, have we? What have we seen from him to feel like that he could, has a decent amount of potential? I know he was a guy that, when we were talking to some other people we were doing collabs with, like they like the idea of their teams drafting him, but I just don't think we've seen enough of him to really say like whether or not a team missed out on him.
I mean, he was projected to kind of be like a 3-and-D guy if he ever figured out the three-point shot. Granted, last year, very small sample size, 23 games played, 43% from the three-point line, but on very, very limited attempts, right? And very limited, minutes. So, like you said, we don't really know what to expect, but he was supposed to be more of one of those versatile 3-and-D wing guys. And if he was able to actually hit his shots, that's where you would see him probably get a lot of minutes in the NBA. But we are talking about Milwaukee here, led by, the very infamous, Doc Rivers, who doesn't really play young guys. So good luck with that. That's my thing, where it's like there's a lot of things working against this team outside of the fact that they bungled the Dame situation.
Yeah, that's the tough part with that is like I said, I don't know if I can expect either of those guys to take much of a leap. I mean, Jackson Jr. is 24, so he's already kind of at that age where not that he can't get better, of course. That's not to say you're completely done in terms of development at 24. It's just I don't know if there's much more upside that he's got left. I mean, if he could shoot like you said, he'd immediately become a much more valuable player. I just don't know if we're going to get that and outside of him, I just don't really see any other young guys on the roster. Like, is there anyone else that you could look at that could be primed to have either a bounce back year or, like maybe their best year yet? Like that you could see some progression?
Not really. I mean, a lot of the young guys are really guys that you kind of would see at the end of the draft or the second round, right? Who don't really project to be a whole lot, and they might kind of just ride the bench their entire career unless they get a change of scenery. So it's like, look at the young guys. You got Jericho Smith, you got Tyler Smith, like you talked about. They even freaking traded away AJ Johnson, who I felt like might have been their potential diamond in the rough last year. So he's not even on the. Yeah.
Oh yeah, they did draft him.
Yeah, they drafted him. Yeah, he's a wizard now. So, I don't really know what the vision was or is for the young guys. I don't think there really is one, if you want me to be, super honest. I guess the only young guy that has a little bit of potential is Ryan Rollins, because I do think he is a serviceable point guard in the league, just not a starter. So, granted, I don't know. There's nobody on this team that really jumps out. I mean, what's up?
Yeah. What about Chris Livingston? Like that's another guy that is I just don't feel like we've seen a whole lot of where it's like what is my expectation of him gonna be? Like,
Yeah, what is he like 21? Young guy, right?
He's listed. Yeah, he's 22. It looks like he's in the last year of his deal. I think he was like the last pick of the draft. I think last year, if I'm not mistaken. So he hasn't really played much at all. So, and that's kind of the point that I'm making, where like none of their young guys really have panned out. Where like none of those guys are real rotational players at all. Like, did any of those guys play in the Indiana series? I don't think any of them did.
Nope. That's what I'm saying. Like, yeah. I just don't think, as long as Doc is the head coach, you're probably not going to see a lot of those guys get a ton of impactful minutes.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you're probably not going to see a lot. Yeah, because he's not going to be a development guy, but they're also not necessarily good enough to just be like, oh yeah, let's give them a ton of minutes.
Right.
That's kind of the tough part there. I mean, do you have a favorite signing outside of Myles Turner? That they pulled off. Like, any of them?
I mean, can I pivot it to a move? Maybe.
Okay.
I mean, like I like Cole Anthony. I'll give him that. I think picking him up was pretty dope, right? He's going to give you a spark offensively that you could potentially, utilize. Doubt he's a starter at all. But it kind of goes back to what you're talking about, right? They have a lot of guard depth, but it's not great. It doesn't scream like, yeah, this is an elite core of guys. This is an elite guard room. No, not at all. It's more of a, passerby, right? I don't know. But Cole Anthony being on the roster does kind of give me a little bit of hope. So I guess that would potentially be one of the young guys, if you want to even consider him a young guy at this point.
Yeah. So, and then I guess the Kuzma thing. I mean, you saw him as a Wizard last season,
Mm-hmm.
right? Obviously, I saw him as a Laker. I liked him as a
Mm-hmm.
Laker. But what did you like? Did you see any differences between what he looked like in Washington versus what he looked like as a Buck? Because I know since he was on the Wizards, you saw him more consistently.
Yeah, yeah.
So maybe there was something that maybe I just didn't notice, or maybe that somebody else didn't notice because we're not watching the Wizards quite as frequently.
Well, in Washington, you could tell he was very disgruntled. He didn't want to be there, right? So obviously
Right.
there's a big body language difference from what I saw in Milwaukee. Definitely was more, you know, accepting, I think, of his role because of, granted, very different, more positive situation for him, right? The efficiency kind of went up a little bit, right? It was around the same kind of games played between them, right? 32 in Washington last season, 33 in Milwaukee last season. So the efficiency did go up, but I don't think it was really meaningful, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
A lot of the stuff that I saw him doing was a little bit empty, although it seemed like he was more engaged in doing the little things, right? But the thing that really sucks is, he had some of his best years in Washington, right, career wise, and I think you would agree he also had very, very solid developmental years in LA, right, doing the little things, right. So you kind of
Yeah.
saw his progression, from kind of like a scorer to
Mhm.
more of like a do it all wing, but now
Yeah.
we're kind of like reverting back to like 2021 coups, right? Where it's like, do we really like that? I don't know. So I'm not really sure where I stand on him. I do know he was battling some health things with the Wizards, but who knows? That could have been completely made up due to the fact that he didn't really like his role, on the team with all the young guys. But in Milwaukee, you could definitely tell there was a little bit of a pep in his step. But at the end of the day, it didn't freaking matter because they got, demolished. So,
Yeah, I'm just not really that high on this team, and I just
yeah.
don't really see a world where I can envision them being really, really good next year. Like, could they win some regular season games because they have a bunch of depth? Sure, but I just, like I said, I don't see a world where they realistically look like a championship level team. And again, it's like I don't really see how you could expect that, just given the moves that we're seeing as of right now. I guess then before we get into the over under, like, so if you think that Giannis is gone, like, do you have a prediction of where he goes?
Yeah, that's the thing because I think a
'Cause
lot
I
of the
don't.
a lot of the destinations that were kind of projected when the buzz first started happening, they've kind of been filled, right? If you want to be honest, right? Houston, they got KD. New York, they've kind of doubled down on their core, right? So I don't know. Honestly, like, do we think Golden State maybe? I know that one's kind of come up. Um I
I
know
mean,
LA's come up too, right? The Lakers, but who knows? I mean,
right.
they come up every time there's a freaking role player, right? So I don't know. I don't know where he goes.
That's a tough one because, like you said, the Knicks, the Bridges, he made it. He signed his extension, but I mentioned like it could be Towns in that deal. But then it's like if you're the Bucks, like is that the return? I don't know. And it's like what return are you gonna get if he asks for a trade? You're not getting back a whole lot anyways. If he asks his way out, right?
Yeah.
And if he doesn't ask out, you're not trading him. I mean, the Warriors one is interesting. It's just more so I don't know what the package would be. I mean, with Kaminga, that situation, who knows what's gonna happen there. Would they have to put Jimmy Butler in the deal? Like, I
Yeah.
don't know. I mean, I don't think they would want to do that. So who knows? I mean,
I'm trying to think.
chances are, whenever he asks, he'll probably have some type of list of teams he'd like to go to. I mean,
I
the
would
Houston
assume
one,
I would assume I would assume there's gonna be the teams are probably gonna have to be bigger market, right? So maybe
Mhm.
Miami.
Yeah, maybe. And then, like say with the Houston one, I mean, that could be like 2, 3 years from now. Who knows what happens with KD, and then maybe he's the next guy after Durant. But
Maybe.
I don't. They wouldn't be. I don't think they would be on the roster together unless you put Şengün and somebody in the deal, which I guess you could do.
I
But
wouldn't do it.
yeah.
Um
But mhm.
looking around, Atlanta has some buzz.
Right. Yeah. That's the part where I just again, if you want to maximize your chances of winning, you probably want to stay East. But if you stay East, you know what team makes the most sense, for him to go to. I mean, again, some of the destinations are fine. I just don't know at this point, and we'll probably know more as we go on. But I don't know if he'll be a Buck after this season. I
Yeah,
mean,
I don't think he will
maybe,
be. I agree with you.
yeah. So now we'll look at the over under. It's a little bit different, but right now, on FanDuel, right, according to them, right, the Milwaukee Bucks over under is 42.5. Right. On a couple other sites, it was like 44.5, but basically like the low 40s is where they're projecting the Bucks to be. So I guess the question is over under.
Under. No questions about it. I think this is at best, I think this is a 40-win team. That's their ceiling. That's the most games I can win. I can see them winning. I think Giannis is probably going to miss a little bit of time, and that's going to contribute to that. But overall, the main reason is this team simply is just not good.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, if we're going by the 42.5 one, basically, like you said, that basically means you're putting them as a losing team, a team with a losing record. I mean, it's tough because, like, in the Eastern Conference, I feel like there's a pathway to winning over 40 games with this roster in the East. It's just how many games can you realistically win against the West? You could win against some. I mean, what was the Bucks record last year? I mean,
48 and
last year,
34.
yeah, yeah. So I don't think they can get to 48 and 34 again.
No.
So by that logic, you almost either have to go under or go like barely slight over, and that's the tough part. So if we average it out, 44, 42 to 43. Yeah, I'll probably take like the slight under, maybe go 42, 41. Because I think they could be like somewhere around 500. Because like you said, especially if Giannis misses time, I don't think he'll play all 82. It's going to be tough to win those. So I guess hopefully he doesn't miss a ton of time. But nobody really plays 82 games for the most part. So
Yeah.
I think that one probably makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So now we'll move on to the Western Conference team in a different situation, and that's the Houston Rockets, right? Where last year, right, I think they were better than what most people thought. We both picked the over on the Rockets, but I think our projection was that they would still be somewhere in the mix of like a play-in team. But they ended up exceeding that. They won 52 games, and they were the 2 seed in the Western Conference, right? Now, they did end up losing in the first round to the Warriors in 7 games, but, they fought hard. But you just didn't get enough of what you needed, right? We know what happened. Like, Jalen Green wasn't that great in the series. He had a couple other guys that were up and down. Van Vliet had some good games towards the end, but some bad games early on. I mean, it was a collective team loss. It wasn't like it was all completely on one person. But, the guy that you did need to be really, really good, he didn't come through. And now he's gone, right? They ended up making a massive trade where they swapped out Jalen Green and Dylan Brooks, as well as the 10th pick of the draft, right? That was in that, they had it was like that giant 7-team deal, but that was their send out. That was what they sent out in exchange for Kevin Durant, right? Who, last year in Phoenix, his team did not have a great season, right? That was a team where I think we picked the over on them because I think they were around like 50 wins was their over under. I think we thought they'd be good in the regular season, not so great in the playoffs, but then they ended up being horrible in the regular season, right? They were 36 and 46. Some of that was injuries, some of that was the team was garbage, some of that was you had some down years from some of their guys. Not enough on either end of the floor, mainly defensively. But now, new team, new situation, and it's funny because I remember I think it was a year ago when this stuff first came up, right? And we kind of poo-pooed it at the time. We were like, yeah, he's probably, they're not going to trade for Kevin Durant, right? Like the Suns will be good enough that he'll probably just be there and then, that'll be that. And then look at what happens a year later. It turns out the initial reports were correct, right? But for Houston, it's wild because they didn't even really give up as much as I think what you would have thought, right? Which is kind of why you thought Houston wouldn't do it in the first place, because you would have kind of assumed that you'd have to give up more than just maybe like Jalen Green and Dylan Brooks. You might have thought maybe Jabari Smith has to be in the deal. Or maybe it's like Reed Shepherd or, some of the other young guys are in the deal. But nope, it was just Jalen Green and Dylan Brooks, who again were good players in their own right, guys who can definitely help you out over the course of the regular season. But in getting Durant, Now you got a guy who can help, who can take over games, right? Especially at the end of games. Not quite the same player he was, but still a very good player, right? Especially on the offensive end. And that I think is going to help a lot of these other guys, right? Where they're not quite there yet on the offensive end, right? Like Amen Thompson had a much improved year, and he wasn't even bad as a rookie. He was good as a rookie, right? Like you could tell that there was potential. But then in year two, he took another leap where, especially the latter half of the season when he was in the starting lineup, he was really good. I mean, he ended up, being on all defense team as a second year guy. That just doesn't happen a whole lot, right? He averaged 14 and 8 over the course of last season, right? And of course, like I said, the latter part of the season he was even better. But either way, the fact that they were able to get Durant without having to give up most of their key guys, and then draft compensation wise, it was 5 second-round picks, and then the number 10 pick of the draft, which they weren't going to use because they didn't really need to have another lottery pick come onto the team, right? That's really good, right? Like that's a good return, right? Like the fact that you didn't have to give up a ton for Durant. When you look back at the last couple of teams, right, where like what did Phoenix give up? It was like Cam Johnson, Mikal Bridges, and multiple firsts, right? First that they won't get back, by the way, right? Because I mean, they didn't even. Well, actually, first that Houston has, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Mhm.
Like, or I guess they were able to get. They gave back Brooklyn's first to Brooklyn, right? But they still have Phoenix's first, if I'm not mistaken. So Phoenix isn't getting those back. Why would Houston do that? But either way, that's the nice part about all of that. And then also they did even more to the roster than just Kevin Durant, right? They brought in Dorian Finney-Smith from the Lakers. They gave him a 4-year deal, but only the first 2 years are guaranteed. So it's really like a 2-year deal, and then we'll see what happens with the last 2 years. They re-signed Steven Adams to a 3-year deal. They brought in Clint Capella, shockingly, surprisingly, on a 3-year deal. And then in addition to that, they re-signed some of the guys that they already had, but then they also re-signed Jabari Smith Jr. to an extension, right? But 5 years, like 120 million or so. That's a pretty reasonable deal, right? It's not like it's 150 plus. I mean, that's good for the number 3 pick in the draft who had to adjust and change his roll up. But now there's some more opportunities where he should probably be in the starting 5. We'll see if it's him or Eason. But either way, he's got some opportunities here to be able to play and to be able to contribute. So they have a ton of depth. They have good high end talent. And then they have promising young guys. Then they have guys in the bench and towards the lower half of the roster that on any random given night could still help out. Like even a guy like a Josh Okogie, right, could have one random night where some guys are out. Maybe he has a decent game and helps them win. Jay Sean Tate used to be a starter for Houston, right? Way back when the Rockets stunk, he was one of their starters, and now he's a guy that probably won't play a whole lot. But just pretty much everything they did in the summer, right? Unlike say the Bucks, I think you have to like in terms of they didn't really do any moves that I thought were bad. The only one that was just weird was the Capella one, but even that one, I guess like you could make the case. Well, Adams may not play a whole lot over the course of the regular season, so just having another big you could put out there is fine. And I guess they found the double big combo for them worked. So now they can do more of that, right? And now they can kind of mix and match and have like these giant lineups. This is going to be one of the biggest teams in the league. So big that it's going to probably be very different than a lot of the other teams where there's still a little bit more balance. But, it's relatively fine because you have a lot of versatile pieces to work with. Thompson is the guy that I'm looking at as the young guy where I think that's the player that probably needs to take a decent leap in order for them to realistically win it all because I think, because we still need to know more about what those guys can do on the offensive end of the floor. Because Thompson, he improved over the course of that Warriors series. It started off kind of funky, right? Because they were forcing him into spots that he wasn't comfortable with, trying to hit those short range shots that he couldn't just knock down. Then towards the end of the series, he just ran past everybody. But there's still going to have to be more of a skill element to his game anyways, especially if he's going to have the ball more, which he probably should since Jalen Green and Dylan Brooks aren't on the roster anymore. So that's the guy that I would probably look at. Şengün, can he make more shots in the paint again? Because it felt like at different points he had some really good games for them in the playoffs, and overall he was good for the Rockets over the course of the season. But it does feel like there are nights where, depending on the matchup, it feels a little bit tricky for him to kind of get the best out of him on the offensive end. But the nice thing is now he's kind of bumped somewhere between second, third, right? Depending on the night. So, as opposed to like you're the number 2 guy literally every night. And sometimes number 1, right? Because we didn't know what we were going to get with Jalen Green. So I think that's probably a more ideal role for him. And then, like I said, with Smith, just continue the versatile aspects of his game. Catch and shoot guy that can occasionally, score on smaller guys, posting up, defending, being able to guard multiple positions. He played a lot of 5 at different points for Houston. He probably won't have to do that as much now, but you'll always have the option. And then Reed Shepherd, we didn't see much of him last year. He was the number 3 pick, and he was kind of a consensus number 3 pick, but he barely played. Now, some of that was just because they had other guys that they preferred to play, but I'd like to see more of him and see what he can actually do when he's given the opportunities, right? Because, he was kind of pitched as a really good shooter, right? Especially off the catch, but also a guy that's got some ball handling skills that could, occasionally in a pinch play some combo guard and maybe run your offense, especially off the bench. So I'd like to see more of that and see what he can really do and see if he's, legit. Tari Eason, right? Another energy guy, right? That can do a lot of different things. Just continue to improve, decision making on both ends of the floor. And I think he's already a good quality player. And then, like I said, pretty much everything else, they can go big. They do have smaller lineups. They can have some switchy defensive lineups where they can have a bunch of wings. They can have a bunch of bigs. They just don't have a ton of guards. But, I'm curious to see how that looks just because, like, you do have Durant who, he's not a guard, right? But he does have guard skills where he's going to have the ball in his hands and he can play off of those other guys. I think he's going to fit really well. And if he can plug up some of the offensive holes for Houston, they'll probably be fine. I don't really have any issues with them from a regular season standpoint. And then in the playoffs, you'll have Durant, who, again, has not been quite as good in the last few series, but he still can be very good. And you do have some better defensive personnel so that way he's not going to be overtaxed on the defensive end. So I think they pretty much did everything that you could have asked for and then some in the offseason. So I give them an A+, and I think they're going to be one of the best teams in the Western Conference. I probably wouldn't pick them to win the West, but they're going to be in the mix. I think you can feel much more confident about what they could do this coming season in the playoffs than last year. Because last year it felt more so like they need a little bit of things to go their way to win a playoff series. I mean, maybe if they got the right matchup, but now I think you feel much better about, okay, outside of Oklahoma City, you could feel decent about picking them against, these other teams. Who knows? Maybe it could just backfire just because of age. And, for some of the other guys, maybe they're not quite ready. But like I said, I think you have to feel more confident about this team, especially if you're, a Rockets fan. I mean, just going from what you were a couple years ago to now this, where now you have a real chance to contend for the title. Like, they're legit contenders. And that's not where they were a year ago. And they progressed very well. And the players in the front office and ownership, you got to thank all of them for that.
Absolute cinema. I think, they had one of the best off seasons that, we've ever been able to really witness, right? Every hole that, was
in Milwaukee.
Come on, man, let's be serious. But, I think every, void that they had on this roster, they've pretty much filled, right? And they left room for internal development. That's the craziest part that I love, right? They're already a young team. They have so many, contending pieces, right? Where you saw them kind of blossoming into their own last year. And, now it's pretty much on them to just really get better internally, right? You brought in the smooth operator. You brought in KD, right? This is going to be amazing. He's going to bring a sense, I think, of stability to this team, right? Because you look at Jalen Green, like you said, you didn't know what you were getting from him on a nightly basis. He could look like an all-NBA guy, but then the following night doesn't show up at all, quite literally. Exactly. So that was the problem, right? Now you've got KD, bona fide scorer. You already know he's going to give you, like 25 plus a night guaranteed. And he's going to take so much pressure off of all these guys, right? I think Şengün is going to be the guy that I'm looking at. What can you do offensively to add to your bag? We already know defensively you're not a rim protector. That's fine. But offensively, what can you do? Can you be a better playmaker? Can you be more efficient in the paint? Can you get better, touch, stuff like that? It's going to be amazing. Amin Thompson, we already know defensively, the guy's a beast, a monster. But offensively, what can you do? Can you actually turn into a point guard? Who knows? That's the cool part about this roster. There's so many unknowns that could really only work out in a positive way. Reed Shepard, that's the guy I think that you're kind of looking at. Well, what does he look like in year 2? Are they kind of gearing up for him to be the Fred VanVleet, replacement at some point? Who knows? But I think he does need to have a much bigger role. And I think, that the problem was he was kind of buried on the depth chart because they were actually a good team. They were, trying to win. And I think if you let him experiment, you probably wouldn't get as many wins as you would probably like, right? Granted, third pick kind of has to play, but I think they did the right decision by kind of stashing him last season. But regardless, I think he has what it takes to be on this roster for sure and be, a competing piece, come playoff time. And yeah, obviously the home run move was Katie, but bring in Clint Capella and Dorian Finney-Smith. Wow, you're doubling down on the defensive identity that you already had last year. Gave up Dylan Brooks. That's fine. Just replace him with Dorian Finney-Smith. I think people would arguably agree that Finney-Smith is better than him, in multiple facets of his game, right? Very good point of attack defender. Can stretch the floor with ease, a little bit more consistent, less hero ball than Dylan Brooks. Granted, Dylan Brooks had a great season last season, but I think you look at Dorian Finney-Smith, and you're just amazed that they were able to pull that off, poach him from the Lakers, and bring in Clint Capella, and triple down on your big man depth as well. So overall, there's nothing that they did that I didn't like. I think the Cam Whitmore thing sucks because you do part ways with a young guy very early, but, it kind of needed to be done. The roster's too crowded at this point. And then you brought in, guys who have a little bit more experience. You still have vets on this team. It's not like it's full of just, young and hungry guys. They're experienced guys who've been on title teams, who know what it takes, to get to that point and can rub off on a lot of the young guys who I think, were missing that last year. But internal development is going to be key for this team. And I'm really hyped for Jabari Smith Jr., Amon Thompson, Şengün as well. I think he fits into that category, and obviously Reed Shepard. So shout out to Houston. Like you said, it's been a long time coming for them because people forgot how bad they were post-Harden.
Yeah, because like I said, I remember when the first year we did this podcast, right? That was kind of when Houston was at its lowest point, right? Because it was already after Harden was gone, and it was during that stretch where people are like, oh no, Jalen Green's not really progressing the way that we think he should, right? And then, you had the issue with the coach, and it seemed like, that wasn't really working out.
Oh yeah, Steven Silas, jeez.
Right, yeah, like everything was a mess, right? And then it was like they didn't really have any veteran guys on the roster at all on top of that. So you really had nobody who could kind of, settle everything down and kind of show everybody the ropes. But like you said, now they have all of that in order to kind of, ease everybody in. So really it comes down to the progression of the young players. And then, aside from that, obviously Durant, him being able to match up against a lot of the other best players on the other teams. If you get both of those things, right, then they have a chance to come out of the West and win it all, right? But if you only get one of those things, then it's probably like, oh, second round, maybe conference finals. And then obviously if you get neither of those things, it's another first round exit probably. But like you said, the most exciting aspect, obviously outside of the Durant part, is to see what those young guys are going to look like, this upcoming season. Because again, like we already saw some really good signs, shout out to those players where they figured some stuff out over the Warriors series. Now you just got to continue to build on that and put it together, over the course of 82 games and the postseason. And now, you have another guy to fall back on Durant, where, you're not begging Jalen Green to have a good game. Like Durant's floor is a lot higher than Green's, right? Just because he's a better player. Right?
Monumentally higher. Yeah, come on now.
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of the nice thing about having all of that, right? So not really anything negative to say. It's just a matter of, are they going to be able to win the championship? But the good news is that even if they don't win it this year, right, those guys can still be better. So you're putting yourself in a position where you're a perennial contender now. And that's where they wanted to be. And they got here in pretty quick fashion. Because like you said, they were pretty bad post-Harden. I think they traded Harden during the 2020-2021 season, right after the bubble. So like you said, it's been a while. It's been a long time coming. But, the Rockets are back. and now, they're going to be in the mix, and I'm very curious to see where they go. I guess the question is starting five, right?
Mm.
What do we think? Who's going to be that fifth guy, alongside Van Vliet, Durant, Şengün, and Thompson, right? Because they have a number of options. I would think it'd be Jabari Smith Jr. just because they paid him. And, prior to Thompson coming in, he was the starter, right? Because he was the third pick of the draft. But, it could be Easton, it could be somebody else. But I would look at Smith Jr. because I just feel like he's probably the easiest to plug in there just because, he can do a number of things pretty well. And he doesn't have to have the ball. There's times where, like, I remember when we were watching, it's like, how come he doesn't get more shots, right? Where it's like, yeah, he's filling in
He's elite,
pretty
man.
nicely. Yeah, exactly. So I feel like it's probably him, and it should be him, especially because they just paid him. But do you think it's somebody else?
No, I think it's Jabari Smith, right? This is going to be a guy who I think turns into probably one of the best corner 3-point shooters in the league next year. I know that might be a lofty expectation, but I'm just kind of thinking from a basketball standpoint on the court,
Right.
what Kevin Durant is going to do for this team, right? Because a lot of the times we saw that Jabari Smith Jr. kind of turned into the grenade guy, the bailout guy, the guy that you go to during broken plays. And I think if they're willing to do that, then I
Mhm.
think that's going to open up a lot of opportunities for him now that you're probably not going to have as much broken of an offense. So I think you're going to see him spotting up a lot more and honestly probably having a lot of opportunities to create out of the post, which I think is a cool area for him because of his height, his length, and what he's able to do with the ball in his hands. So
Mhm.
yeah, I think creation and corner threes are going to be his bread and butter. And I think, yeah, that's the perfect thing that you could really use to complement a starting lineup like that, where you do have, a strong primary offensive creator. You have a lot of defenders as well, but you still need 3-point shooting because, not everybody in that starting five is knocked down. So I think adding Jabari Smith Jr. in there is the only sensible move.
I think it's mainly just balancing things out so that way you maximize most of the best parts of his game, right? Because you don't really want him dribbling and creating quite as much. Not that he can never do it, but it's not as strong of a part of his game as just catching and shooting.
Sure.
And then, like I said, attacking mismatches. And like you said, with Durant there, that's the guy that's going to be the grenade guy now, right?
Yep.
Like, not that you only want to give him the ball at the end of the clock, but that's the guy where you can give it to him and feel good about it as opposed to whatever it was last year, right? Where it'd be a different guy every possession, right? And that's, and it's like, okay, it's one thing to have a bunch of different guys, but you do need a main guy for the offense to kind of run through. And, you need the other guys to be able to play off of him. So I think that's where you're going to see, even if the quote unquote stats don't necessarily reflect it, I think you'll see like the best version of Jabari Smith Jr. this year, where, offensively, again, like I said, catching and shooting, you mentioned the corners, right? So all those other areas of the floor where you want your non-star players to operate, and then defensively because he can switch and guard multiple guys. Like, I think he's going to do all of that as
Yep.
long as he's comfortable doing it, which he should be, right? Because he just got paid. But as long as he's comfortable with that, there's no real reason to be low on him. Because like I said, the on-ball stuff for a number 3 pick is probably not where you'd like it to be. But just on this roster, I don't really know if you're going to ask a whole lot of that anyways, because you have other ball handlers. They don't have like a ton of perimeter ball handlers, but just, you have Durant, you got Thompson, you got Van Vliet, and even Şengün will have the ball in his hands sometimes, more than Jabari Smith, just because of what he can do as a, playmaker.
And
So
yeah, this will be
that
the first time that we've seen, this iteration of guys without Jalen Green. And I'm telling you, it's going to make a massive difference because teams are going to have to guard this team completely differently.
Right. Yeah. Again, you're replacing a guy whose floor is very low with a guy whose floor is pretty high, right? Like, I mean, obviously anybody can have a bad game. It's just like you mentioned, Jalen Green. There's a lot less, because you use the word stability with Durant, right? Like with Jalen Green, as you mentioned, there's nights where he looks really good. I think it was game 2 against Golden State where he had like 40 points, but then there were other games where you didn't even realize he was out there. And like defensively, he made some strides and improvements. He just never improved in some of the areas like the playmaking, right? Where you needed that out of him. And Durant's not like a great passer playmaker, but he's better at it than Jalen Green. It's a much more reliable. It's a much more reliable part of his game than Jalen Green. So that's kind of that's the simple part, right? Like yeah, like maybe you'll miss Dylan Brooks' defense. Maybe you'll miss the fact that Jalen Green's a great athlete and is pretty young and is pretty durable, right? Like Durant doesn't play as many games as those guys. But I think overall, as long as he doesn't miss a crazy amount of time, you know, like the floor, maybe who knows, they could lose like a few more games, but regardless, I think they'll still win a ton because you have the young players. And in the playoffs, I don't know how you couldn't feel better about them. Is there any way, or is there anywhere where you're kind of thinking, if this doesn't improve the way that it should, like maybe there's some concerns, or like, based off of the makeup of the roster, what's like the weakness of it?
Um, I think saturation, maybe, right? Because you're gonna have to play all these guys, right? You're bringing in Dorian Finney-Smith, you're bringing in Clint Capella, so you've got to find a way to get those guys minutes, and that's kind of the problem that they had with Cam Whitmore. So that's why he's not on the roster. So how do you balance that out? That's going to be the question of the day, and I think honestly, it might come down to durability. Whoever's healthy is going to be playing. So I think that's what, unfortunately, it's going to come down to, and that's where I think the Reed Shepard conundrum, I think, kind of is going to rear its ugly head, because where do you find minutes for him on a roster this crowded, and you brought in a lot of proven guys versus, okay, everybody on this team is young as well. So that's kind of the thing that could be a little bit concerning. But at the end of the day, I think the young guys are competitive. They're willing to earn their spots, right? Like Atari Eason was a guy who was kind of projected to be more of a project kind of guy. Like, okay, yeah, he can come in and give you, spot minutes, but, that's a guy who, his hands are all over the ball, right? He's getting deflections left and right, and he's going to be a great point of attack defender for this team, coming off the bench, assuming that's what he does. But there could be a realistic version of this team where, yeah, Atari Eason might beat out Jabari Smith in competition, right? And who knows what that looks like. So, like I said, that's the beauty of it, because I don't think that would be a negative for this team going forward, right? You have so much young talent, but yeah, I'm super hyped for this team. This might be my most watched team outside of the Wizards for me.
Yeah, because for Udoka, right? I mean, last year there was nobody where he was like, oh, even though you're playing poorly, I'm still going to keep playing you. I know it kind of happened in the playoffs somewhat. That's kind of tough because it's like you need some of those guys to play well. It's kind of hard to just bench guys that you need to be good when they're not playing good. But like in the regular season, like we saw a bunch of games where it's like, hey, Jalen Green, sit on the bench. You're not closing in this game, or even Şengün or Jabari Smith, any of those guys, right? Like, if they weren't playing well, they wouldn't close.
Right.
And if that continues, like, yeah, I mean, he's kind of set up like a pretty strong competitive culture, right? Where, like you said, I mean, Thompson wasn't starting early in the year, right? Like, we didn't know what was gonna happen with him. We liked him. We thought he'd be much better. But just, you looked at the roster and it's like, is he gonna start? Could he start? And then eventually he started because he was too good, right?
Yeah.
I think it was Jabari Smith Jr. got hurt and he took advantage of the opportunity and never looked back. And then Jabari Smith Jr. was the sixth man, right? So now, you're going to continue to compete for roster spots. And chances are you probably also just have some flexibility maybe for trades too, right? Like, I mean, they have so many, like you said, they have some guys on the roster that seem a little bit redundant where, like you said, maybe there's a scenario where if somebody gets beat out for minutes, then they could just be moved, right? It may not be like any of the main guys, but maybe some of the bench guys, like say, I don't know, like say Clint Capella, or say Steven Adams actually does beat out Clint Capella, or vice versa, right? Maybe one of those guys randomly gets moved, at the deadline for something. Not saying it's gonna happen, but
I
just
know what you're saying.
something, yeah, just something along those lines, is kind of what you're looking at, right? So,
Yep.
like you said, this is a team where I think this will be a pretty exciting team to look at and see what they're going to do and how those guys continue to progress, how Durant comes in and fits in. Um, I guess the question is, their over under looks like it's 54.5. They won 52 games last year, right? And then, yeah, so the question is over or under?
Over for me.
Mm.
I know durability is probably going to be the one thing that could potentially, turn this into a dumpster fire next year, but I don't care. I think, adding a guy like KD and having the offseason that they had is going to net more than, three wins, like three more wins. I think this is probably a 60-win team.
So that's a good case to make. I think the main thing is that as if the guys progress the way that they should, then you could lose Durant for like 5, 10 games, something like that, and still be able to win.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're So if we believe in these guys like we do, right, then I think you got to take the over. I don't know if they're going to win 60, but I think they will probably win mid high 50s at least, right?
Yep.
We'll see what happens
Yep.
because the Western Conference is going to be tough, right? The Western Conference got better, so they're going to have to beat some teams that maybe they had some problems with last year. But I am curious to see, what happens, right? Just because, again, this team made a significant amount of moves to improve their chances, and I think probably now, at least in the playoffs, like I think they've moved over some teams. So like last year, right? Like they lost to the Warriors in 7 games. We can't really. It's kind of hard to really talk about the Warriors roster because it's still not done yet, right? Like we still have to figure out what happens with Kuminga. But that, like, that's a playoff matchup that I would be interested in seeing, like a rematch of those two teams and see what it looks like, and see what happens, right? Because
Yeah.
it went 7 games after Golden State was already up 3-1, right? So it ended up actually being more competitive than it looked. But like you said, I think as long as Durant doesn't miss like 50 bajillion games or something like that, they should be somewhere in the ballpark of where they were last year. Like maybe they could, like I could see a scenario where like they win like 51 or 50 just because, like you said, he misses a few too many games or something like that. But if they're gonna actually win and contend, they need to be as good or better than last year, right? Like if they're going to try to win the championship, because we've already seen like 50 is probably like kind of the least amount of games you could probably win in the regular season the last few years and win the championship, right? Like the Pacers were in the game 7 against Oklahoma City. That was like, what did they go? I think they went 51 and 31, if I'm not mistaken, or did they go 50 and 32?
I think they went
I think it was
50 and 32.
Okay, yeah, 51 and 31 was the Knicks. Okay, so either way, like they need to do a little bit better, I think, to probably win the championship. If they can get to like 54, 55, if they can hit that over under and go over, then they have probably a really good shot at being able to win the Western Conference. I guess the question is, what would it take for them to be able to beat Oklahoma City, as because Oklahoma City I think will still be the favorites in the regular season. They actually matched up against them pretty well. They split the season series. Now again, we learned over time that the season series don't mean a whole lot come playoff time because there's always some missing context. Somebody missed a game. There was maybe it was like 3 games in 4 nights or 5 games in 7 nights or something like that. You at least kind of look at the blueprint where it's like a bunch of physical size and a bunch of athletes to bug Oklahoma City on the defensive end. And then usually in those games, Jalen Green played really well. You just replace him with Durant. So do you believe that they have a real shot at beating Oklahoma City? And that might sound like a silly question, but do you think they will beat Oklahoma City this year? I guess is more of a bold question.
Yeah, that's kind of crazy. I think it's possible. I could see the roadmap. Defensively, I think they have what it takes. Offensively, that's going to be the question, right? Because I think the big question mark is Thompson, because they could easily just sag off of that guy and pack the paint. And things could get very ugly very quickly, because then that is going to siphon into Jabari Smith Jr. problems. It's going to siphon into KD problems as well. So that would be my one concern is, what does Amen Thompson look like, especially on the perimeter? But defensively, I think they have what it takes to go toe to toe with that team.
Yeah, and then I guess the main thing is, so do you view them as the second best team in the West, like behind Oklahoma City, of course, or do you think that they're third? Because I think they're definitely a top. I would say top 3. I mean, I guess it depends on where you have. Like, do you think they're better than Minnesota? They're definitely top 4. It's just a question of where in that top 4 after 1 are they? Are they 2, 3, or 4?
I think they're tied with Denver. If you want me to be honest, it's hard for me to, you know, slight Denver in any way, shape, or form, because they do have Jokic, right? And I think that weighs a lot more than, the roster of Houston. Jokic is a very, very proven talent. KD is much older at this point in his career. But also look at the offseason that Denver had as well. Like, we can't just, skate over that. So I think they're honestly neck and neck, but I would probably give Houston the slight advantage just because obviously KD's my guy. But also I'm high on the young talent on that team. And depending on what kind of leaps and internal development happens over the summer and really in the next couple of months, then, yeah, I mean, I'm taking Houston.
Yeah, for Denver, I think the main difference is Denver's guys are mostly in their prime, whereas
Yeah.
with Houston, it's guys that are still really young and developing, not all that experienced yet, and then guys like Durant who are towards who are in the latter part of their career. I probably would have Denver slightly, but like you said, I think the main thing is they're both really close, and there is a world where either team, has a real shot of making it out of the Western Conference. You know what I mean? Like I don't think that obviously with Oklahoma City they're the favorite, but again, as I've said many times, right? Like as of right now, according to this decade, history is not on Oklahoma City's side to make it out of the West and win it all again. So if it's not Oklahoma City, right, I think your best bets are probably either Denver or Houston. And we're going to know, I think, pretty early on, right, what those young guys look like. Obviously, there'll be an adjustment period, right, because, Durant's a different player from those guys, but we know he's pretty easy to plug and play. But I think, like I said, we'll know early on whether or not those guys, have improved to the level of, all right, these guys are ready to be, a real part of a championship team. Because, usually at that age, they're not quite there yet, but you at least have a little bit of, a buffer with Durant where, he can kind of fill in a lot of the gaps, in my opinion. But that's the only thing that's not letting me put Houston quite over Denver yet. But like I said, if we see early on that those guys are legit, then that's where they actually where you may move them into the second spot. But I think at the very least we at least saw some elements of they should match up well against Oklahoma City because they have a ton of size. You're a little bit less athletic, I guess, with Durant just because of his age. But the skill element has been drastically improved, right? Because he's just overall a better, more skilled player than Green or Dylan Brooks. So there's trade offs there, but I think the trade offs are mostly positive. It'd be pretty hard for me to say they're going to miss, Jalen Green now that they have Durant. Like the only main difference is maybe the amount of games played, but on the floor, right, it's a clear upgrade, which is why, yeah, it's hard for me to put them anything less than a top 3 roster. But how do you view them, I guess, against Minnesota? Because Minnesota is the team that's been to the conference finals back-to-back years. They went further than Denver the last 2 years, including beating them a couple seasons ago. But the difference is with Minnesota, they haven't really done anything significant with their roster, right? It's more so running it back, see what their young guys can do in terms of progressing. And then they lost Nickeil Alexander-Walker. But how do you feel about Minnesota versus Houston?
It depends on Ant. What does Ant look like in that series? We already know he's a guaranteed playoff riser. He'd be going up against his idol favorite player, Kevin Durant. So that would be a series that I would literally pay to see that. That would be amazing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm still taking Houston just because I think their tenacity and what they bring to the table, potentially on paper, is going to be pretty phenomenal. And then the problem is we only have a small sample size of what Houston really looked like in the postseason. But in theory, on paper, you add in a plug and play guy like Kevin Durant alongside the internal development. I think Houston has more going for it in a series like that.
Yeah, that really, like we said, it all comes down to the progression of the young players because, and whether or not there's like any significant drop off with Durant. But like as long as the young guys progress, like, they should be really close, right? They should be one of the 3 best teams in the Western Conference. If those guys can get there, right, then they have a real shot. If they're not quite there yet and they still need some more time, they'll still be a threat. They'll still be a contender, but maybe not quite good enough to get out of the Western Conference. But, again, it all also comes down to what Oklahoma City ends up doing next year, right? Because we know that they could be better as well, even though I mentioned history is not on their side. But, this should be, I think, a really good team to watch. Are there any other guys on the roster that you think people should look out for?
I mean, we kind of hit on what all the young guys, the vets. I mean, we hit on all those guys as well. So, I mean, I think we covered all the bases. I mean, maybe let's talk about Fred VanVleet for a second, right? I think he's going to have another. I think he's another guy that might be privy for a bounce back year, right? Because that was a lot of pressure put on him by Jalen Green because he had to kind of pick up the slack when the offense wasn't really going, especially when you saw him in the postseason. And granted, that's kind of what his job is supposed to be. But I think with a guy like Kevin Durant, he's going to be more reliable, and I think we're going to see a more efficient Fred VanVleet, and also a guy who can maybe be a little bit more defensive minded as well. So I am kind of curious, what he looks like.
Yeah, and his first year in Houston was probably one of his best seasons of his career,
Hmm.
right? And then I mean, I know he was an all-star a few years back and he had some other good years in Toronto, but like cuz he's generally been a relatively inefficient offensive player, but he shot over 40% from the field and almost 40% from three. So to me, that's a win, combined with what he brings defensively. And like you said, the leadership and the playmaking. And shout out to him because his contract, which we hadn't even really mentioned, because they re signed him, right? He opted out or they declined his team option and he signed a 2-year, $50 million deal, second year being a player option. So they gave him a much more team friendly, or he signed a much more team friendly deal so that way, they go from, paying him 50 million a year to where that's, cut in half. And like that's going to be pretty helpful for them cuz like you said, he's a pretty important player cuz one weakness of the roster is they don't have like a lot of those guard ball handling type players. They don't have a lot of those guys, so you're kind of looking at outside of Van Vliet, like you mentioned, that's where Reed Shepherd comes in. That's where Amen Thompson comes in. That's where Durant comes in. So that's one thing that I think could be a problem potentially in the playoffs against some teams where it's like you don't have a lot of great ball handlers. So maybe against like a very pesky defensive team like Oklahoma City, that could be a potential problem. But how many teams are constructed like Oklahoma City? Like there's a lot of good defensive teams, but there's not a lot of teams built like Oklahoma City. So that's why I feel like against most of the other teams, they should be fine, which is why I do have them as one of the three best teams in the Western Conference. It's just like I said, the ceiling is ultimately going to be determined by if those young guys continue to progress. Because if they're better, along with what you're expecting to get out of Durant, then that's where, like you said, you're going to get the best version of this team. And we kind of outline most of what we would like to see from a lot of those young guys, right? We mentioned Thompson, we mentioned Smith, we mentioned Eason, we mentioned Şengün, and because those are the main core guys he's on the team. And that's how I think you look at the offseason is they did a great job in adding a bunch of talent without really having to give up really significant pieces of their core. Because of course, like Jalen Green's a good player. And, I guess, yeah, like it's unfortunate that they had to move on from him, but like you did get back Kevin Durant. And it's like if you had and we knew you weren't gonna keep all of those guys,
Mm-mm.
right? But the reality is that if you were gonna decide which guys to trade, it'd be Jalen Green. And we talked about it, right? The moment he signed that contract, we knew he's gonna be gone at some point because he signed an extension that nobody usually gets,
Yeah.
right? If your team is sold on you as a long-term piece, right? It was a 3-year deal with a player option. So you knew at some point, yeah, he's gonna be gone. And now he's gone. It wasn't even a year,
Yeah.
right? I think because he signed it relatively late in the summer. He wasn't like a day one of free agency extension like some of the other guys.
Mm-mm.
It was a while before they gave him that extension. I guess same with Şengün, but Şengün's was a 5-year max, right? Like
Yeah.
no questions about that. And I think we were more confident he was going to get it
Oh
anyways.
yeah. Yeah. Much more proven. Much more consistent.
Yeah, so we'll see what happens. We'll see where we go from here. But I think Houston has definitely put themselves in a position to be one of the best teams in the league next year. And as long as they're healthy and as long as those other guys progress, they'll be really good. It's just a matter of whether or not they can win it all. But I don't think it's going to be. This is like it's championship or bust, but it's not quite as championship or bust as some of the other teams. Like because it's just like it sometimes it's kind of difficult to go from where they were to winning the championship. But at the very least, they put themselves in a position where all the hard work was done in the summer. So now you have, training camp, preseason, regular season to figure everything out, as opposed to having to kind of mush it all together at the trade deadline, like we've seen some other teams do. This is how you want to do it if you're gonna try to contend for the championship. I
I
think this
agree.
is more of an ideal route.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so now we're gonna get into some news and rumors. Funny enough, two things happened literally that we talked about in the last episode, not knowing that they were gonna happen, and of course they did. And one of them was De'Aaron Fox. He did sign his 4-year max extension. Both of us were pretty confident that he was gonna sign it. We didn't know what it was gonna be. We weren't predicting a dollar amount. 4 years was a little bit different because I think most of what we've seen has been 3 years. But either way, right? He's inked a long-term big max extension that's going to presumably keep him in San Antonio for a while. And we talked about it, right? Like, even though they drafted Dylan Harper and they have Stephon Castle, like they traded for Fox. I'm sure it was some type of agreement where it's like, yeah, they're going to trade for him. They're going to give him an extension. And we barely seen him and Wemby together, right? They played less than 10 games together. And now we're going to see what that looks like with year 3 Wemby and all these other young guys that they've put together. And, I think this is going to be a really good group. We'll see how far they can go in the regular season. We'll see if they make the playoffs. But, no real issues with it whatsoever. It is a lot of money, right, relative to maybe some of the other, star level guys in the league. But I do think De'Aaron Fox is really good. And again, like, if the answer is either this or let him walk or trade him, like, give me this all day.
Yeah,
Because at
I
the end of the
agree.
day, we need to see more from the other guys before we automatically commit to Harper and Castle.
Exactly. That's the crazy thing. And it's mind boggling that there's even mixed like opinions and reviews on this one, right? Like I don't know how we got to the point where people are really divided on a De'Aaron Fox extension, right? And me being the biggest Dylan Harper advocate in the world, he's still unproven. He hasn't played a minute of NBA action, legit NBA action. Castle, we don't
Right.
even know if he's going to be serviceable in the next couple of years. And that's not to say that he's a bad player at all. I'm just saying Fox is proven talent. Granted, the postseason success isn't amazing, but look at the team Sacramento built. Absolute dumpster fire. So shout out to San Antonio for locking up the guy long term. This is money over time. No problem with it.
Yeah, exactly. So can't wait to see what they do. Should be fun. And then the other thing was when we did our Boston Celtics off-season video, right? Of course, right? Just a few days later, right? They pulled off another move where they ended up trading Georges Niang for what RJ Lewis, and then they basically used that to bring in Chris Boucher, right? So he was waiting in free agency, and now they're bringing him in, right? Two-way stretch big. He is an older guy at this point. He's 32. So he's not, he's no longer like a young player that you're just kind of taking a flyer on. But I guess at least you can say you kind of got like a stretch big, outside of Niang, and like this guy, I guess people like Boucher more than Niang. They're kind of in a similar tier of players. I mean, I guess maybe, yeah, I'll bump up my grade to a C minus, for their offseason. But like, it's not like anything significant. But either way, it saves more money because Boucher is making less money than Niang, right? And so now it gives them even more financial flexibility and even more of a position to get ready for the tank machine. Because I think it was HoopsWire that put out that their expectation is that Tatum doesn't play next year. And like I said, I just don't think it'd make a whole lot of sense
No.
to bring him back
Why would you do that?
anyways. Like there's clearly a roster that's geared probably towards tanking.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what would the point of bringing him back be? Risking another injury.
Yeah. It makes no sense. But Boucher, no problem with that. No problem with that.
Yeah, he
And
was traded, and Niang was traded to the Jazz, by the way. Should have mentioned that part.
yeah, no problem with that. Smart executive move. Shout out to Brad Stevens. Continues to be, very, very smart in terms of what he does. So no problem with it.
Yeah, and then we did get a report from ESPN, right, about the idea that Trae Young, this is from Mark Spears, that Trae Young is disappointed that the Hawks have not offered him a contract extension. He said, "What I'm hearing now at this point, you can tell by Trae's tweet, and I saw him during the finals. I think he's disappointed that it hasn't come and it hasn't been offered. So don't be surprised if he plays this out and sees what happens next summer." So this, I guess this was related to like the Dallas Cowboys thing, right? That was right, and Trae Young was talking about that and was like, this is why you pay the man early when someone will take less early to stay in a place he wanted to be in forever. You do it. The price only goes up now. Get what you deserve. So there is no extension as of right now. If he didn't make All NBA last year, so he's not going to get the 5-year, $345 million deal. Instead, it's like 4 years, $229 million, right, or whatever. That's the extension. But what do we think happens with this? Because I know that the reports that he was pretty active in their offseason business, where he recruited the guys to come to the roster. Like he recruited Nickeil Alexander-Walker, recruited Luke Kennard. But interestingly enough, right? Like, yeah, we don't have a Trae Young extension, and who knows what's going to happen with that.
Yeah. I think it might be a domino effect of, De'Aaron Fox and stuff like that. But at the same time, I think at this point, we as NBA fans know that Trae Young is super underrated, in his career right here and right now.
Right.
But I think he still has to prove, can he be the franchise, right? And I think that might be what Atlanta's kind of hinting at, right? Like they're giving him a shot. This is a team that's really centered around him for sure. And granted, I think they could be a top 4 seed in the Eastern Conference this year. So let's get back to, competitiveness. And I think that's what they're probably looking for. Like, what does Trae Young look like in a competitive setting? We haven't seen it in a while. So that might be what's going on there, but we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. So do you think he gets it?
I think he gets it at some point. When? I
Mhm.
have no clue.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, because I guess because like I guess I'm looking at it and I'm like, well, if Trey Young just walks, what does Atlanta do to really fill in that spot? I mean,
Yeah.
like I guess you could just build it around everyone else, but is that really much better? I mean, is that really better at all? I mean, I feel like it's
No,
not.
no.
So you need somebody offensively who can kind of put all that together. So I would say he gets it and that
Yeah.
he, sticks around long term. Because again, like I mean, where else is he gonna go? Because that team is kind of built in a way perfectly for him. But like you said, they may just be in a wait and see session and just be like, well, we put together a team that is pretty ideal for a player of your skill set, your strengths and weaknesses. So now it's up to you to kind of showcase what you can do and how far you can take this team. And I think everybody expects the Hawks to be better next year.
Yep.
Yeah. Then, last but not least, we did get from Brett Siegel of Clutch Points that he believes that the Bulls and Josh Giddey may soon reach a compromise of a 3-year, $70 million contract. Now, Jake Fisher, he mentioned the idea that the Warriors could be interested in Giddey, where it could be like a Kuminga sign and trade that sends him to Chicago. I don't know which one is closer to being, correct, but I would think Giddey would be more likely to go back to the Bulls. And like in fairness, it wasn't like he was saying it's 100% going to happen. He's just putting out like, yeah, the Warriors like Giddey, and if there was a sign and trade where he goes to Chicago, like that could be a key piece that comes back because the Bulls would like to keep some of the other guys. But it seems like we're probably headed to a conclusion to the Giddey situation relatively soon. And if it's like 3 years, 70 million. I mean, that's not the worst thing in the world because it just, it's obviously less than what he was looking for because he was looking for what the 30 million, I think, a year range, but instead it'd be like 23 or so, which, again, it's less, but it's better than taking the qualifying offer, or something like that, right? So, and that may just be what he has to do because, again, market's not there.
Yeah, exactly. That's the problem with a lot of these unrestricted free agents, and it's holding a lot of stuff up, right? Like I think we're still waiting on Quentin Grimes, we're still waiting on
Yeah.
Cam Thomas, Kaminga. So not a lot of market for these guys, unfortunately. But that's the name of the game.
Yeah. I mean, we'll see what happens, but now then we'll conclude. By looking at a couple of comments that we got. So we'll start with our Instagram, and we'll start with our poll, I guess. And in our last one, it was, will Luca lead the Lakers to a championship? And it was 50-50. Now, when I wrote it, I didn't say this year, right? The main question is like at some point in his tenure, will they win? So I think that's a question where it's like, yeah, it's 50-50 because we know he's great, but we have to see what the roster looks like long term. And as of right now, they're still kind of in this mix where they brought in, a few more guys, right, that probably make more sense next to them, but they still probably have work to do. Probably won't win the championship this year. They'll be really good, right? But they're not going to be considered one of the favorites. But, if Luka continues to be a top 3 player, you have a chance. But what do you think? Because like I said, it was about 50-50.
Yeah, I could see why it's split. Depending on how they build around him, I mean, it's Luka's the same guy he was in Dallas, right? So as long as he's on the team, there's a shot at the championship. He's been to the finals before. It's just a matter of building the right team around him and getting over the hump.
Yeah, and then in the comments on that poll, one of the comments said Luca and Braun's still going to have to carry, sadly.
Well, I hate to burst your bubble, but I don't think Luka and Braun will be winning a championship together. But I do understand the point of, okay, yeah, look at the roster. DeAndre Ayton, Marcus Smart, yeah, those are great additions, but does it take pressure off of Luka and LeBron? Not in the slightest.
And I think that's, I guess, kind of what they were hinting at. Where like you're still going to be relying on those guys, and all the teams are going to be relying on their main stars. When we did our Lakers offseason video, the main question and concern that we had is the back end of the roster, where it's just not very deep. And who's the guy who's a guy off the bench that you look at and be like, oh, this is a guy that on a given night, could have a stretch of some really strong performances. And most of those guys are kind of just hit or miss, or they just, are kind of negatives on the offensive end of the floor, right? So,
Yeah.
that's kind of the problem with that.
Yeah.
Then on our YouTube short, we had a different comment, very different direction, that said the Lakers could care less about this season. It's becoming evident the new management are more focused on moving on from LBJ this season than winning a chip. So it's a different direction, a lot more negative. Not that the other one was positive, but that one was definitely an even more negative direction than the other one.
I think it's fair criticism, though, because a lot of the offseason before, they did eventually get DeAndre Ayton and Marcus Smart was kind of centered around, well, is LeBron even going to be here? Right? Like, is any of this going to even matter? And the organization has made it perfectly clear that Luka is the guy going forward, and that's how it should be.
Yeah, and the first comment was from AJ_B1 of 1. And then on YouTube, that comment was from Akeem Griffith 2959. Didn't mention their names, but now I have to. So there you go.
Shout out to them. Thank you for the
Yes.
comments.
Yeah, and again, if you want to join in, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes Podcast. If you want to join in on any of these, just leave a comment on any of our posts on any of our socials at the OBT Podcast. We do IG polls, so you can always look at that. Always join in. You can leave comments on the YouTube Shorts or the YouTube videos. We'll check out those and read them as well. And continue to like and subscribe because, again, we're getting a number of subs for this off-season content. So we're going to keep doing it, as the summer's going on because there's not a whole lot of NBA content to discuss except for, a lot of these off-season teams on paper. So we appreciate all the support. See you next episode.